When I was growing up in kindergarten, first grade, when we talked about Columbus discovering America, I think it was a given that he discovered America.
It was definitely a very sugar-coated version of the story. There was more to it.
Then it wasn't until I was older, then I realized just how poorly they were treated.
Today it seems silly that we would accept that perspective, but I remember learning that, and I remember thinking, well, he must have discovered America.
My name's Stacy Gray, and I'm born and raised in St. Joseph, Missouri, and lived there my whole life.
I'm Fran Bartlett, and I teach history, politics, and Native American studies at Lawrence High School.
Hi, my name is Tanner Ashenfelter. I'm originally from Camp Verde, Texas, but I live in Lawrence, Kansas now, and I'm a theater and film student at the University of Kansas. So my experience, to give you a little background, was I went from sort of kindergarten to 8th grade in Texas, and then I went all of high school here in Kansas at Lawrence High School. My experience in Texas was, I remember it being very by the book, and oftentimes the textbooks were very outdated. Textbooks, there's a lot of imperfections within them, and it's sort of less about what is there and more about what's left out or reduced to a little blip.
Pretty much every account is biased in some way. The textbook that I use, it's called First Peoples. It's by Colin Calloway. And then D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This is old. In some ways I have a hard time using it because it is so old. I've had people be critical of me for using this. It's a great book, but it's terribly sad because it goes in depth into the stories of each tribe's individual removal stories. I had some parents ask me about it, and I explained why I used it. It was good for us to remember these stories, and especially for white students, because they don't know these stories. What they said to me, and what I completely agree with, is that this book, as well as a number of other sources, only focuses on that sad story of removal and genocide. And I think that's good because most Americans don't know. But it's bad because it doesn't teach that we are still a living people. That yes, these things happen, but that's been a long time ago and we still exist. I've started to use other books as a result of that conversation that focus more on culture, Indian country today, and things like that.
In Texas, there was really nothing that resembled an Indigenous Studies class. That didn't really exist. It was kind of unheard of. So, and especially if you had Indigenous ancestry, that was not necessarily celebrated or taught about, so it was kind of an unknown. In high school and elementary level, the K through 12 system, it's very unfortunate that you really only get stuff like that. They're considered like specialty classes.
We're always talking about the historical lens and the historical perspective, and making sure that as a student of history, try to look at the event from the perspective of the person that's telling it without applying our judgment from 2025. But then also, what are our perspectives of this now that it is 2025 on this person's actions that they took?
I do remember them saying like some degree of Columbus discovering America, which is, that thing you always hear when Native Americans have lived there for way longer.
There's things like that we didn't know, that we were just shocked by. I think it was just probably maybe it was just the easiest thing to teach, I guess, at that time.
Today it seems silly that we would accept that perspective. The growth of that mythos over time is terribly harmful and definitely a Eurocentric perspective. It creates a narrative that something doesn't exist until it's valid from the Eurocentric focus of our material. Over the course of American history, it was promoted to be that way, that Columbus discovered America so that we could justify the dispossession of native lands.
In St. Joseph, within, like, say, my neighborhood, it was predominantly white. There wasn't a whole lot of diversity.
Well, I grew up in a small rural environment, and there were no minorities in my community. It was all white. It was a farming community. Lots of times you find that kind of mentality in those smaller places when they've not been exposed to different groups, different perspectives, different ideas, different cultures. There does seem to be a not important, not valid, doesn't need to be taught, don't need to think about it.
To be honest, I've lost a lot of friends in Texas because of disagreements onset by widespread ignorance about several different topics. I don't really know a whole lot about my own Cherokee ancestry because of not having learned that earlier.
As I've gotten older, I've learned that history does repeat itself, so there's a lot to be learned from history.
Learning and teaching of history is incredibly important. Our past influences are present in our future. It's important for the general population to be aware of systems of oppression that exist and take advantage of the vulnerable. Teaching history the right way can be a push in the right direction towards a more empathetic and efficient sort of society.
Of course, I think that history is probably the most important topic for everyone to know because that's what I teach. But I think teaching history and learning history is important for a variety of different reasons. It's important to develop research skills. It's important to develop critical thinking skills. All of those things are skills that we teach our students in school, all the way from taking notes, writing, reading, research, how to pick a text apart and find the substantive narrative within the text and understanding how those accounts fit into the context of whatever time period or whatever event that's being studied.
If we can teach these things to students earlier on when they're young, then I think it can have an impact, pushing our society in a more empathetic direction. History impacts our present and our future.
Just not with such rose-colored glasses. I think even when they're younger in grade school, just to remind them that they were here first.
And that's another thing that you commonly run into in the curriculum is speaking about Indigenous people as if they're a people of the past, even though they're still here and their culture is still thriving.
We need to broaden our perspectives, broaden our understanding of who we are as a country, because ultimately, when you teach history, what you're doing is you're creating a community. For most people, that community has to be inclusive. And so the teaching of history is a creation of unity. It's a creation of a culture. It's a creation of a sense of pride. And it creates, ultimately, a narrative of who we are as a people.